Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Beam. I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as your Secretary of Agriculture, and I want to welcome you to the 7th Annual Governor's Kansas Summit on Ag Growth. I appreciate everyone taking time today. The focus here will be on the pork sector. Now, our main event, our main Ag Growth Summit, is scheduled to be live in person next month in Manhattan. But we wanted to continue with having the opportunity for some of these sectors to go virtual and allow more people across the state to participate ahead of the actual growth summit. So again, today our focus is on the pork sector. And I just want to thank all of you for your devotion to Kansas Ag and attention to the pork sector. It's a very important part of our Kansas economy and our Kansas agricultural horizon. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne Ryan-Numrich and let her kick the session off. But again, thanks for your participation, and I hope that you'll be engaged as they give you directions to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Beam. I'm Suzanne Ryan-Numrich, and I'm with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Agriculture Marketing. We're glad you've chosen to spend time with us online today. We'll focus the next hour on the Kansas pork sector. The pork sector is an important sector of the state's agricultural economy. According to estimates prepared by the Kansas Department of Agriculture and based on the Impro economic data model, the estimated direct impact of the pork industry is $529.5 million in output and 2,722 jobs. Including indirect and induced effects, the total impact of the sector on the Kansas economy reaches $861.6 million in output and 4,505 jobs. The vision of our agency is to provide an ideal environment for long-term sustainable agricultural prosperity and statewide economic growth. Our summit sector sessions provide the platform to entertain opportunities and barriers to agriculture industry growth for our state. First, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. During the presentation portion of the session, everyone's microphone will be muted by the meeting host. If you have a question during the presentation, submit your question using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. The host will grant permission to unmute your microphone after the presentation portion, and we encourage everyone to contribute to the discussion at that point. At any time during the Zoom session, when asking a question, please include your name, city, and organization. Lastly, the session is being recorded and will be posted online. I'd like to now go over the agenda of what we're going to discuss this morning. We're going to have Dr. Brett Kaysen with the National Pork Board share a little bit about sustainability. We're going to have Dr. Sarah McReynolds with the KDA Animal Health share a little bit about what they've been working on in the last year. And then we're going to have some time where we spend a moment sharing a poll and talking about industry outcomes and things we'd like to focus on for the coming year. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Brett Kaysen. Dr. Kaysen is the Senior Vice President of Producer and State Engagement for the National Pork Board. He leads the organization-wide grassroots relations effort to support pork producers in their priorities and build trust and add value in U.S. pork. He also serves as the administrator for the U.S. Pork Center for Excellence. In his previous role of Senior Vice President of Sustainability for the National Pork Board, he worked to strengthen food chain and consumer understanding of pork production practices by developing research-based communication strategies that engage and influence key decision makers. Prior to his role at the National Pork Board, Brett was the Western Regional Business Director for the U.S. pork business at Zoetis and led a team of 11 sales professionals who served pork producers and swine veterinarians with their animal health needs. While at Zoetis, he was also a dairy production specialist, helping dairy producers apply data and genomics to improve health and profitability on their dairies in Colorado and Kansas. Before joining Zoetis, Dr. Kaysen was a key member of the Animal Science Department at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. There, he spent 5 years as interim undergraduate teaching coordinator and 13 years in various instructor positions. In 2012, he was selected to receive the Best Teacher Award given by CSU Alumni Association. Dr. Kaysen believes strongly in youth leadership development and has served on the National Junior Swine Association as Youth Advisory Board Chairman. In addition, during his time at Colorado State University, he coached the livestock judging team for 6 years and spent 2 years as Youth Extension Specialist, where he developed numerous 4-H livestock materials and programs to further strengthen Colorado's agricultural youth programs. In 2016, he was inducted into the Colorado 4-H Hall of Fame. Dr. Kaysen earned his degrees from Colorado State University. He holds a bachelor's degree in animal science, master's degree in agriculture extension education, and a PhD in animal sciences management system. He resides in Iowa, where he, his wife, and their 2 daughters raise pigs, which they enjoy showing locally and nationally. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kaysen. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Suzanne, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today and the opening by the secretary, humbling opportunity for me to speak to the group. Obviously, I didn't write that bio because it's awfully long and lengthy, so hopefully we didn't bore you with all the details, but it does tie into where I'm coming live for you today from Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm working from my remote location, actually on vacation today, and 2 young daughters that were mentioned earlier, and I see Dr. Darushi's on as well. We're at the Summer Spectacular, where is a large event for young people to come together and exhibit pigs and work on their leadership skills. So thanks for the opportunity to be involved with you and spend a little time with you here today. So I'll let whoever's in charge cue those slides and we'll jump right into it. The topic today that I want to cover with you today is around sustainability. And as you can see, the title of the talk, Offense or Defense, what I'm going to portray to you today is what the pork checkoff has been leading, is a sustainability strategy that actually does both. So next slide, please. When we talk about sustainability, as I first joined the staff 4 years ago at the National Pork Board, and Bill even asked me to be the Assistant VP of Sustainability, I said, okay, as an animal scientist, I want to learn more about what it is. And what I learned 4 years ago is depending on the business in which you are a champion for, defines, I guess, then the definition you have for sustainability. And I know that's a frustration for farmers sometimes, whether they be in Kansas or my home state of Colorado or where we reside in Iowa now. And they'll say, well, Brett, help me decide or define what sustainability means for my operation. But really, from a national organization strategy perspective, we take a step back and say, okay, as the National Pork Board, as leveraging checkoff dollars that's funded by producers, the lens that we look our strategy through is, can it help a producer make money? Can it help them save money? Or can it help them save time? And you all work with farmers on a daily basis. Some of you on the call may be a farmer yourself. And if something is to be sustainable, it's also got to be economically profitable. So we look through that lens on a daily basis as we deploy this strategy. The other thing sustainability is it gives farmers the opportunity to create and capture further opportunities beyond the farm gate relative to the data in which they currently are collecting or could potentially collect in the future. And thirdly, then it becomes a strategy that allows other companies to reach their sustainability goals. And I'll touch upon that here in a couple of slides moving forward. Next slide. When I mentioned the conversation around helping other companies reach their goals, here's just a spattering of some of the headline news you may have seen as of late and or have read. It seems like you can't go through a day in which you can't see someone setting a bold goal. And when you think about the end user of our product, from the live farm component to the packer processor, and then ultimately on to the consumer, the farmer at the farm gate plays a role. And you can see these smattering of headlines, but take it a step further and you think about the world of Amazon and Walmart and Kellogg's and some of the major food companies like Nestle and Mars that have made sustainability claims as well. They can't help but reach back down into the supply chain and ask farmers to be a part of the solution as they make these bold goals and they report against these future commitments. Next slide, please. The thing I want you to make sure, though, that you can help me as you lead farmers across Kansas and or across the country, depending on your reach of network, is sustainability isn't just something that is necessarily the main story of your production system, but it's something that you build into your production story. And what do I mean by that? So a lot of us have been doing stewardship or sustainability for multiple generations on our farms. And so it's not new to us, but it builds into our current story that we have. Let us not forget, and I remind a lot of the consumer packaged good companies, efficiency and productivity go hand in hand with sustainability. And sometimes when I speak to non-agriculture audiences, I think they tend to separate those things out. And we at the Pork Board say, no, efficiency is important, productivity is important, and actually they're key drivers from the sustainability story. Next slide. So take you a little bit back in time and show you a little bit of the formula of success in our strategy at the National Pork Board. And this is really the equation. Those of you that are familiar with the pork industry, they're on the audience today, and I'll have a slide that touches upon this in a moment. But the We Care ethical principles that have been around for over a decade has been what pig farmers are committed to. I think of those as their values. Those have been tried and true and in place for a long time. We multiply those by current production practices that are in place. And I think of just my career in the pig business, growing up as a young person in Colorado, having sows on dirt lots, and now we've moved into these modern type facilities. We continue to refine and improve our practices over time. And ultimately, skipping the circle to the right of practices intentionally, ultimately, the placeholder picture on the right is not just a placeholder, it's there with intention. We as the industry are really seeking to gain trust from our modern consumer that you can see there. The young mom with baby on hip, looking at her electronic device in the store, deciding, I want something that's good for me, good for my family, good for the planet, and I want to feel good about purchasing and consuming that product and repeat that again. And so as I stepped in my role 4 years ago on staff, I knew we were really good as an industry on our principles. There's no question we continue to refine our practices. Quite simply, we have to stay relevant. Yes, we want to gain public trust, but the open flank or the weak flank we had was in the proof points. We had some data, we had some success stories, no question, but the modern day eater in the marketplace is demanding more. And so as I stepped in, I said, we've got to bolster our proof, which is part of the offense portion of our strategy that'll go in more in depth and detail here in a moment. Now, before we advance from this slide, I will tell you, when you talk about proof, ultimately, when we started with We Care over a decade ago, it was based on the mantra of continuous improvement. And we put our hand over our hearts, if you will, and said, we are dedicated, trust us, we'll continue to get better. And that worked. That worked 10, 15 years ago. The modern place says, I trust you, but verify. For those of you folks online can appreciate this, as a kid that grew up in Colorado, I remember my dad always said on the ranch, he'd say, trust everybody but brand your calves. And as an 8-year-old kid, you didn't quite get that, but it's really that trust but verify model. Next slide. And so where have we been? Next slide, please. This talks a little bit about We Care. Hopefully those of you that are familiar with the pork industry know about We Care. Again, developed in 2008, it was a producer-led initiative in cooperation with the two national organizations, that being the National Pork Board and the National Pork Producers Council. And it serves as pig farmers' promise and commitment to their values and ethics on farm down to the eater that consumes the pork product. Next slide. There's 6 ethical principles. One of the first things that I was asked to do when I joined on staff is 4 years ago, look at those ethical principles, look at We Care, shop it in the marketplace, and is it still relevant? Create a task force of producers as well as industry experts and scientists And not only did those producers say 4 years ago, is it not only relevant and still works today, although created in '08, it's more relevant than it's ever been. And so what I want you to take away from this slide is you look at those 6 ethical principles. A lot of times when you hear people talk about sustainability, they really focus in on the center, right? On the bottom row in the center on environment. That's really where they hone. And let us not forget that sustainability should be a management systems approach to this challenge or opportunity in front of us. And so you see the ethic of people and the ethic of animals is involved here. You know, let us not forget, although some of us would like to, 2020, the idea of public health and how we protect people and pigs. You know, the human component in terms of, you heard those statistics of what pork does for the state of Kansas. That's a huge community piece to sustainability. And so this is the path for us in terms of a future strategy, is a systems approach to sustainability. Next slide, please. So part of this strategy, and when I talk about defense, that the title slide is, let us not forget to take credit for the things that we've already done. Just because the word sustainability has become really mainstream the last 4 years doesn't mean that we shouldn't step back and say, but look at all the improvements that we've made. And so I show you this data set that comes from a study we did with the University of Arkansas. And it's a life cycle assessment study that we sliced data from 1960 to 2015 into 5-year increments. And essentially, when you talk about per pound of pork produced, and you evaluate on land, water, energy, and emissions, from 1960 to 2015, the denominator again being per pound of pork produced, we're using 75% less land than we used to, 25% less water, 7% less energy, and have reduced our carbon emissions by 8%. Now, to dig into those numbers just a little bit more, some folks look at the 75% land footprint and say, well, that's obvious, Brett, why you've reduced that, because you moved pigs inside. Well, that's part of the component. But let us not forget the 2 biggest factors in our emissions, in which we emit as an industry, come in the audience of the feed stuff in which a pig eats. I saw Dr. Kokash was on here earlier, and then the manure in which a pig produces. That's where you get the most of our emissions. So that land savings really comes from, and we've got to give credit to our row crop farmers as well. You folks online know the 2 main ingredients in a pig's diet are corn and soybeans. And when you think about as many bushels of corn and soybeans that we raised in 1960 per acre as is 2015, that's dramatically changed. And so, yes, we should take credit for housing type, but we also have to give credit to the feed crop or the feed supply chain portion of this equation. So tremendous improvement that we've made from 1960 to 2015, and we're on that journey to improve even more. Next slide. So where are we headed? Next slide, please. So what you see in front of you today is just a rudimentary slide that I use with general audiences, whether it be a 3rd grade elementary class, or if I'm in a meeting with McDonald's in Chicago and their corporate executive levels. And what you can see if you study those 6 different icons are those 6 ethical principles. And essentially, we've just simplified and mapped out the pork supply chain and said, okay, if we look at this from a supply chain level and we look at our ethical principles, what within those ethical principles should we measure, monitor, and report relative to our success of sustainability in the pork industry? Next slide. And so what I'd like to do is give credit where credit's due into the dairy industry. And they were the first mover as an industry, where the dairy industry came forward and said, we're going to set bold goals for the industry as a whole. You may have heard of the net zero initiative or carbon neutrality by 2050 for the dairy industry. Back in the spring of 2020, essentially what I did is stood in front of our board of directors and I said, dairy's a first mover. You as leaders of the industry, do you want to set goals for the pork industry to work towards relative to sustainability? And being typical pig farmers that in my mind have always been very adaptive and agile and progressive and play offense, they said, yes, let's go do that. But what I want you to take from this slide is you have to do this right and not reckless. And sometimes you have to slow down the process to actually speed up. What do you mean by that, Brett? Or what did you do? Well, we said, before we just go out and start setting goals for an entire pig industry or 60,000 pig farmers, let's do our due diligence. And we worked with Ernst & Young to step back and say, okay, from a domestic and international perspective, what are the value drivers or the societal drivers that our customers are asking of us as farmers? And remember, I said domestic and international, because 30% of our product is shipped across the globe. And so we looked at that. We looked at what those drivers were to build trust and add value to pork. And then we started to prioritize that with a group of producers. This was a producer-led initiative facilitated by the National Pork Board. Once those producers prioritized those various environmental issues and social issues, then they said, okay, now we got to step back and say, how bold do we want to be? How ambitious do we want to be relative to greenhouse gas emissions, relative to community giving, relative to diversity, equity, inclusion, those types of things? And they wrestled with those, and they really broke those down into categories of, we're going to be, moonshot goal or super aggressive. We're going to take kind of a middle of the line or moderate approach, or a conservative approach. And so look at the drivers, prioritize the drivers, set your ambition. And then what they did is they drafted these goals and put a timeline to them. Again, the title of the slide is important. It was a producer-led initiative. The goals that I'm going to direct you to evaluate more were driven by pig farmers themselves. Next slide. So why goals? Why metrics? Why data? And those of you on the call, it all makes sense to you, I'm sure, and our producers, it makes sense. We all know our farmers are taking in all kinds of data all the time. They've used data to their advantage since the beginning of time. And so what we've done is work with these farmers to say, okay, if you walk through that barn door, you're constantly measuring, monitoring, and reporting. You're constantly benchmarking yourself against others. We're just going to do the same thing in the sustainability space, because without those goals as a pork industry, it's hard to demonstrate progress to our downstream users of pork and pork byproducts. These metrics give us an ability to measure on those goals. And then really the mantra here is, here's where we're at today, but where are we headed and how do we get better? And farmers can get their head around that because, as I said before, they do it on a daily basis. They just haven't thought about it as much in the sustainability and the stewardship space. Next slide. So I would encourage each and every one of you, if you'll take a note, to go to porkcares.org, porkcares.org, and that will soon to be a website that we're repurposing and reevaluating. But at porkcares.org, you will find the first ever published U.S. pork industry sustainability report. And within that report, what you'll see is actually the goals and the metrics for each of those 6 ethical principles. And so I would encourage you to go there to learn more. We don't have the time to break through every one of those goals today, but you'll see what these producers set in terms of the goals for these various ethical principles. The why behind this is important. And there's several systems out there that have created their own goals and metrics for their pork production system or their packing industry. And that's a great thing. But at the end of the day, in the role that I play, for instance, here at the end of the month, I have some very, very important meetings with very, very important customers, whether they be retailers, quick service restaurants, white tablecloth restaurants, or food service. And yes, they appreciate these different individuals, producers' goals or company goals, but really what they're looking for is, Brett, show us the picture of U.S. pork as a whole. We represent one brand on behalf of the 60,000 producers, and that's PORK. And that's why we had to create an overall national offense and defense strategy. Next slide. So I'm going to go to the next slide here and talk to you a little bit about how we're getting part of the data. So if you'll advance one slide, you'll hear something, and those of you that follow the checkoff, hopefully you've heard of on-farm sustainability reports. But really, this was a test and learn I started with one independent producer in Missouri in 2018. I know Tim Stroda's on the call today, and he's been very helpful to the pork board in this strategy. We expanded to Iowa and Minnesota after we had a really successful event in 2018. And now we've moved from the pilot project status to, next slide, to taking this strategy to a national level. And so on the next slide, what you'll start to see is some of the data that we're capturing. And this is just a snapshot in time. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 equivalents or carbon capture, but what does that really mean? And what we've done as the checkoff is we've actually allowed the producers to lean into this particular technology where we deploy a team on their farm to gather on-farm data, whether that be row crop data from their fields and or in-barn data from the barns in which they manage or help co-manage. Next slide. And what we've been doing with this data is, first of all, giving those individual producers their on-farm sustainability report so that they can say, hey, because of the tillage practices within the row crop that feeds my supply chain, or maybe doesn't feed my pigs, but utilizes my manure, because of these practices, we've emitted, less tons of CO2 equivalents. But then we take that science, as you can see on the slide, and we put it into a soundbite that their neighbors, their county commissioners, quite simply the food companies I work with can understand. Because it's hard to visualize, well, what's 39,000 tons of CO2 equivalent look like? But they can get their head around, well, that's like taking 7,761 passenger cars off the road for a year. So science into soundbite, farm by farm for the farmer to use, but also in an aggregated form of data for we to utilize as the checkoff to promote, build trust, and add value to pork. Next slide. So the long range goal or strategy on the offense is, think about a locker room full of data. You walk into a locker room and it's the team locker room, but there's individual lockers with individual names on it. And so those producers have their individual set of data that they can use as they see fit, and they can share or not as they see fit as well. We take that data and then we roll it up into a state report annually. And so, for instance, in Iowa and Colorado and Kansas, at their fingertips, they would be able to use as a state executive of a state pork association or as a U.S. agriculture leader within the state. Here's data that suggests that Kansas pork farmers are sustainable, and here's why. Now, we don't necessarily know individual farms because that's the producer's data to keep, but we blind it and aggregate it at a state level. Ultimately, then, the offense is we take that state data and wrap it up into a national report. And Brett uses that with some of the audiences I've already talked about. But think about the sustainability goals and metrics I just spoke about a little bit. That national data then allows us to benchmark our progress over time and demonstrate our continuous improvement. So it's recorded, it's reported, and it's third-party verified data. Next slide. So what do we have to date? So to date, and we've really just kind of ramped this work up here, to be quite frank, in the first 6 months of 2022, we have 250 farms participating across the country. We have an estimated 250,000 acres of row crop and other crops in the system, and roughly 2.4 million pigs within the data set today. Now, as a scientist, I sit back and in my role, I'm like, well, but I know, that's not a lot of acres. That's not a lot of pigs relative to the population nationally. I get it. And that's why you could see at the bottom, we encourage our producers to request a report at porkcheckoff.org with their checkoff dollars that's already funding this work. But I'll give you a tangible example. I won't provide the name of the company, but I had the opportunity to meet with a company, a large quick service restaurant company in Minnesota about a month ago. And they said, Brett, we want you to talk about sustainability relative to the pork industry. And I had some executive leaders in the conference room, and I pushed across a set of data that represented these farms, these acres, and these pig numbers, and started to break down all these different goals and metrics with a 2-page set of data. And they lifted their head from the database or from the sheets, and they said, no one else, Brett, in the protein sector has data like this. Farm data that's verified and third-party validated. This is impressive. So that meant a lot to me. Although these numbers may not mean a lot to you, in a food company's eyes, even though it's only 2.4 million pigs and 250,000 acres and 250 farms, they're like, boy, we can't get this, and we haven't been able to see this from other sectors. This is a positive story for pork, which gets me excited, as you can tell. Next slide. So next slide. Industry sustainability reports. I'm just going to slip through these next couple slides extremely quick to keep us on time and on target. But really what I want you to know is when you go to porkcares.org, you'll see an animal well-being goal that we can build trust and confidence in U.S. pork, taking credit for some of the things we've already done, folks, like Pork Quality Assurance Plus and Transport Quality Assurance Plus, things that are near and dear to our producers, but that a lot of our customers and consumers don't know about. Next slide. We've also set environmental goals, and I will tell you, just to make sure we're all clear, of all the environmental goals that were set, the most challenging one for the producer-led initiative to set was the carbon reduction goal and the greenhouse gas reduction goal, because those things are a challenge to set. It's an evolving science, and depending on the global accounting methodologies you want to use, it can get a little confusing. So that's the one they wrestled with the most, but they did set a greenhouse gas reduction goal for the industry. In my personal and professional opinion, is very realistic, very attainable, and very common sense in the approach they're taking. Next slide. You can see there then that greenhouse gas emission goal that I alluded to is the second bullet. By 2030, a reduction of 40% from a 2015 baseline, in which I alluded to that 2015 work early in the presentation that the University of Arkansas did for us. Next slide, please. So again, I'll just mention quickly here, we're taking a management systems approach to sustainability, and that we think community giving and our people should be included in this system of setting goals. Next slide. Next slide. The other thing I want to share with you is another tool that our producers have available to them is something called the carbon footprint calculator. And so the sustainability reports are really focused on the feed input side of our business. The carbon footprint calculator, that's where folks may just own a barn. They want to get the carbon footprint of their particular finisher or sow farm and stay away from their row crop inputs. This tool is available for pork producers today as well. It's now been moved to web-based and updated in terms of the manure management calculation. So another tool in the toolbox for our producers to use. Next slide. All right, moving forward. Next slide, please. What's next on pork board strategy relative to offense? And then we'll get close to close here. I would ask, and I would encourage those of you online, is continue to go to porkcheckoff.org and let's get more farmers involved in these on-farm sustainability reports. That is paid for by their checkoff dollars. They've made the investment in the checkoff. Let's leverage that asset on their behalf. This world of carbon markets, and I call it the wild, wild west, carbon markets. How do I get paid? I don't give one talk without Brett. What should I sign up for? What should I be afraid of? What should I be aware of? What should I look for a business decision? So you'll be seeing a white paper come out soon and more webinars from your checkoff relative to this carbon market space that's confusing. Business decision-making tools. Early in the conversation, I said, it's got to make us money as a producer, save us money or save us time. We're actually creating in these sustainability reports now return on investment models that, okay, I'm doing pretty good here, but if I move my practice there, what does that mean to me fiscally? And then there's another database in which we're capturing more robust data, even at greater scale, called the We Care Goals and Metrics database. That could be a conversation in the future for one of your breakout groups. Next slide. So around the world of research, what are we doing? And I say around the world because we are leading some research that goes beyond our domestic borders. The pressures that the pork industry faces, we see nationally, and you may see it in Kansas as well, is there's going to be continuous questions about air quality. There's going to be continuous questions as we're seeing in the state of Illinois and Iowa and other places about how does pig production impact water quality. Boy, soil health continues to be a discussion. How do you capture that carbon into healthy soils? Well, manure plays a very positive role there. How do we continue to do work in that space? This whole idea of, and our swine nutritionists from Kansas State University that are on today, this idea of this nutrient cycle that we feed a pig. It produces pork, but it produces this amazing thing called pig manure that goes back into the soil, and we start the cycle again. We've been doing this for decades in the pork industry. The sustainability experts call this the circular economy. Let's do more work around there, and how can we be as efficient as possible with those nutrients that we're putting into a pig or that we get on the backside of a pig to grow that organic matter in the soil. And then finally, obviously, as we learned in 2020, that was a test and learn of how good are we relative to depopulation, something that's not fun to talk about or do research around, but is important. And then how do you dispose of those animals in light of, what I believe is our biggest risk to the pig farming business is foreign animal disease. And so if we have to control that in, I hope the day never comes, knocking on wood here in the hotel room, depop and dispose of animals at large scale. How do we do that the most appropriately to protect the pigs, the people, and also the planet? Next slide. And so that concludes my conversation with you today, and I'll hold there for questions. And I don't know if you want to entertain those towards the end of the session later here as we approach your folks' noon hour, or how you want to handle that. But I'd ask you to take my information down if you'd be so kind, and do not hesitate to feel free to send me an email or call me on my office number, and happy to have further discussions and answer whatever questions that you may have. So with that, I'll pause and go on mute and turn it back to Suzanne.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Brett. That was a great presentation. I know Dana's been monitoring the chat for questions, but I encourage you, if you do have a question that you have not submitted yet, to go ahead and do that in the chat. Dana, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Actually, we do have a couple questions that have come in, Brett, with it. One of it, I want to reflect back to something that you said when you were talking to the food service industry. You were talking with high-level executives on all of the data, et cetera. The question came in is, how do those executives get that information down to the lowest level, those that are interacting with the consumers? Because when you see through media, social media, print media, on their signs at their establishments on the sustainability, it's the frontline workers that get the questions. So you can't necessarily just say, just go to this website, because consumers don't want that for an answer. So how are those at the top in the food service getting the story out on sustainability, but so that their employees can get that word out?
Well, that's a great question, and it is a strategy that needs to be deployed. And I'm not going to act like I have all the answers, but here's what I'll tell you, is that we start at those upper levels, right, in those C-suites like I talked about, but then we try to marry that story with their corporate story so they can leverage the good work of pork in their franchises and stores. So what we really do is put our marketing and promotion team with their marketing promotion team and say, hey, it doesn't have to be a checkoff branded or a Kansas Ag branded product. Use this data, put it in sound bites with maybe the symbol of the golden arches, how best resonates in your stores. You know your customer better than we do. So it's really a partnership opportunity. But you're right, those questions are coming, at the cash register, through the drive-through, those types of things. However, an example I'll give you in the international space, we work hand in hand with the United States Meat Export Federation. And one of the highest value market for pork internationally is in Japan. Japan retailers are now asking if they can use this data on a QR code on a pork chop, so the consumer could scan the code, and it links them back to Pork Cares to look at some of these data sets. I've actually seen that in person. It's pretty amazing work. So there's an example of the international space, and then it really comes marketing in the C-suite, that these drivers of the industry and restaurants can move that down to their customer. Not easy, it's hard, and it's consistent conversation for sure.
Well, your answer leads right into the next question that I had come in with it. So we're going to go big picture, crystal ball that you have there in your hotel room, because you pack that with you when you go places. I'm positive of that. So globally, will there be sustainability requirements before a market will accept our U.S. pork? So you kind of touched a little bit on that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is a great comment. It's coming. And actually, to be quite frank, folks, it's here. I'll give you the acronym World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. That council is made up of 200 of the most powerful CEOs in the world. They currently are putting a framework together called Responsible Meat Initiative for Pork. And their goal is that they're wanting us to set these standards globally that pig farmers would have to meet to merchandise, buy, and move product. Okay, this is all high level. I was fortunate enough that one of the allied industry partners that's a part of this group said, hold on, before you do that, the pork industry has already set goals. They've already got data. So why don't you connect with, the pork checkoff and share the framework that producers have already built? You'll find it exciting that although we didn't get everything into the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Responsible Meat Initiative for pork, when their goals come out live, you will see them eerily similar to what pig farmers have created. So the answer to the question is yes, and it's already being done. And, interestingly enough, last week I was in Nashville, Tennessee for a meeting. I went down to a Publix 3 blocks from the hotel just because that's what I like to do during breaks and spare time. Greenhouse gas emissions were listed on some of the pork products there in the shelf. Product from Canada, by the way, but it had GHG emissions for the Canadian pork industry listed. Those things are here and they'll continue to come.
You talked a little bit on the sustainability issues, and water was listed on there. Water quality piece of it. Water quantity. There are many states in the area, as far as the Midwest, et cetera, and the further west, severe drought with that. So as we have the cream of the crop on this call with it, what do you see going forward for the pork industry, quality quantity issues, to make sure that the pork industry continues to be strong?
No doubt we have to address both. It's not one or the other. We have to focus on quality and quantity. Couple examples. In Iowa, it's all about quality. Okay. And so you're talking to a Colorado native. Our idea of water was it had to come out of this thing called a pivot. I spent a lot of time in Western Kansas, okay, Garden City and Liberal. And so, these things are important. So water quality in the Raccoon watershed in Iowa River watershed is important. We're actually mapping where pig farms are and determining the great work pig farmers are doing to improve water quality. But where I grew up in, basically where Denver International Airport's at now, I remember my dad and grandpa always talking about in the West, water will be as much as gold someday. Didn't get it as an 8-year-old kid. We're starting to get it. And so in Liberal, Kansas, and Garden City, Kansas, and Western Kansas, where a lot of your pork production's at, that's a, arid environment. And so we've got to make sure we utilize every gallon of water appropriately. However, something I want everybody to think about. Actually, if you think about pig farms, they're a great recycler of water. So you take a gallon of water that you run through a pig farm versus a gallon of diesel fuel that you'd run through a pig farm. Once you've burned that gallon of diesel fuel, it's emitted and it's gone. That gallon of water that a pig consumes, some of that goes into the pit/lagoon. We utilize that water, we put it back into the soil. It has this wonderful thing called evaporation. And then, when it happens, you hope that it's going to rain in Western Kansas around Dodge City, right? And so that's the thing I always work with these food companies is it's not the same. A gallon of water is recycled and reutilized as opposed to a gallon of diesel fuel. So in short, quantity is important, quality is important, geography really dictates what the strategy should be.
Great. There was one last question that came in, and this kind of really goes to the heart of why we're having this section on growth, et cetera. So from a point of view, from your point of view, and others that are on here as well, what can the state departments of agriculture do, especially Kansas, as far as supporting our pork producers in our state, really to move forward on things? Are there initiatives that we need to support? Are there policies we need to go for? What can the Kansas Department of Agriculture do from your point of view with it and those that you represent?
Yeah, thank you. And where KDA plays a huge role, and shout out to Tim Strota that's on the call, I think today, is lean in. And my call to action would be your pig farmers have paid for these on-farm sustainability reports with their checkoff dollars. So that tool is out there for us to deploy a team and that tool at their farm level to measure, monitor, and report their sustainability footprint. So I'd ask that KDA promotes that amongst the pig farming community and say, did you know this asset is here? Not only is the tool there, but the team to help you get the data into the system so that you're not on your own. We put a team around you to make it as seamless and easy as possible. And boy, you have a tool at your farm to share your story of sustainability and how you're going to get better. So that's where I would ask KDA to lean in and say, listen, it's a great tool. It's third-party verified. Nobody's going to try to sell you something. it works to your advantage, and it's your data to build trust and add value to your community and what you do.
Well, that's a pretty easy ask. So with that, Suzanne, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaysen, for taking time out of your busy day. I hope the show goes well for you and your family there in Kentucky. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McReynolds. Dr. Sarah McReynolds is our Assistant Animal Health Commissioner with our KDA Division of Animal Health, and she would like to provide some updates on what the division has been working on over the past year. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Suzanne. And this ties very well with some of what Dr. Kaysen mentioned. But first off, Kansas has rolled out the Certified Swine Sample Collector Training Program. And this is a national program. We're just one of the states that's rolled it out. And this program is designed to train producers and caretakers on how to properly collect samples for swine. And this is for diagnostic and surveillance purposes using a standardized curriculum. So this is a national level program that training program that state animal health officials in different states work with private veterinarians who then work with the producers and caretakers on how to correctly collect, handle, and submit those samples, working with the industry during for example, a foreign animal disease outbreak. The other thing we're continuing to do, and hopefully most of you on this call have already heard about this, but we're continuing to support the secure pork supply. And we assist producers on the development of plans, and we're continuing to work on annual assessments to make sure those plans are current that are in place. So you can always find more information on the secure pork supply at their website, which is www.securepork.org. And the next thing I want to talk about is this past March, the Division of Animal Health, in partnership with the Kansas Pork Association and the National Pork Board, we did participate in one of the full-scale swine depopulation and disposal exercises that was mentioned in that previous presentation. So this is just one way we're trying to continue keeping African swine fever out of the United States and then preparing for any foreign animal disease like African swine fever that would possibly get in. So that continues to be a top priority for us. And with that, we've also opened enrollment in Kansas for the U.S. Swine Health Improvement Plan, or U.S. SHIP. That was a presentation we heard last year during this pork sector, was more information about U.S. SHIP. So we have opened enrollment with that, and that includes an African swine fever, classical swine fever monitored certification program. So this aims to mitigate risks for disease introduction and provide a practical means of demonstrating freedom of disease, especially to our trading partners. And this will also support interstate commerce and movement of pigs to get them going again in the face of an outbreak. So this program is intended for all types of pork producers, large, small, exhibition youth. And in Kansas, we currently have over 170 sites registered. And as far as across the United States, there are over 5,000 sites registered. And that was of early June. So I'm sure those numbers will increase here on the next report that's coming out. So those are my updates, Suzanne.
Thank you, Dr. McReynolds. Are there any questions from anyone for Dr. McReynolds on those updates she provided? Seems like she has some great opportunities to get involved if you'd like to. In addition to what Dr. Kaysen shared, you should not be bored with opportunities to get involved in the pork industry. All right, thank you, Dr. McReynolds. We'll move on to the polling questions. A big part about what the Ag Growth Summit is identifying priorities and action items to work on in the coming year. So we would like to poll the participants in this ag growth sector on your top 3 priorities you think we should be addressing in the coming year. And if you have a priority that's not listed, we would encourage you to write that in the chat.
Suzanne, I think it might be important to note that you should scroll down too to make sure you get all the selections.
Correct. You should scroll down. There are quite a few you can pick from, and there is an other option at the very end. Again, if you have something that you think the industry, the state of Kansas should be working on in the pork sector, please drop that in the chat box. We'll give you a few more seconds to finish that poll if you haven't already. All right, so the results of our poll looks like developing tools to manage a disease outbreak, protect food supply was first. Expansion of talent development and educational training. And then maybe K-State research and extension engaging in applied research. And I would like to share with you guys, if you didn't know already, that those pork sector document is posted on the Kansas Ag Growth website. And so I encourage you to look at that. And I'd like to thank you for your participation today. A recording of this webinar will be posted online at www.agriculture.ks.gov/summit in the following week. We sure hope you're planning on joining us in Manhattan on August 18th for the Ag Growth Summit. You can register for the event at the summit webpage as well. There will be a social the evening before, and we would love to have you there. Thanks again for participating in the pork session today.